For anyone who doesn't know him, and I suspect there's very few people who don't, Richard Lerner's been a visionary that's been leading this field for as long as I can remember, and I'm old enough to be remembering things for a long time. So, and I know in graduate school I first heard about his work. He was doing this longitudinal stuff that really is amazing that somebody would think about this idea. You actually keep after people for years on end to try and find out how they grew and developed over time. This is something everybody now considers absolutely critical to lots of the aspects of the work we do. And over that time, he's been a visionary in how lifespan thinking and developmental methodology and understanding of context and secular change and a number of other key areas of how we think about adolescence and youth and context and how we think about development of youth. And probably the thing that he's most known for at this point is his leadership in starting to talk about the idea of let's look and see how kids do right, how kids do well, how we can support them, how we can see youth, along with other visionaries, start to talk about youth as assets, as kids as capability, as I think social capital is the current version of the term we're using to talk about this, and how we can help promote that and understand that scientifically, so that he's a great model for us in that way too, the vision, social concern, and the scientific interest. Rich is currently the Bergstrom Chair at the Tufts University and the Director of the Institute for Applied Research in Youth Development in the Elliott Pearson Department of Child Development. He's also the editor of the Journal of Applied Developmental Science, former editor of Journal of Research and Adolescence, and many awards. Among them, the one I'll mention is the one I had the honor of giving him 2 years ago, was the John P. Hill Memorial Award from the Society for Research on Adolescence. This is an award that's not given out necessarily. It's not we give it out every time it can be given out. And it's given for lifetime achievement. And Rich was clearly the person that deserved it. And there was you could just feel it in the room, the palpable joy to hear that he'd gotten this. And so it was something that I remember, and I think it's a good way to get him started. So.
Good morning, everybody. 3 weeks ago yesterday, the field of positive youth development and the youth of America lost a great mind, a great advocate, and a great friend, Peter Bensen, whose work has been so integral in the field that we're here to talk about and celebrate, died unexpectedly. He had been battling cancer, and we all thought he was doing well. I just want us to try to remember Peter and all the wonderful things he did to bring us together and to create the opportunity that we have here through Youth-Nex. So I just wanted to start that way. I'm sorry to start in a negative way, but I'm sure many of you were friends and remember Peter. Some of you who've heard me talk about my research know that when we ask the typical American parent, is their young child doing well, the typical American parent says, yes, they are. And if you then ask them why, how do you know, what's typically said, other than for school grades, is they're not smoking, they're not drinking, they're not engaged in unsafe sex, they're not a bully. We define good in adolescence, or at least most people in the American public defines good in adolescence as the absence of bad, not by the presence of those strengths that we want to point to that mark a flourishing, thriving young person. Not too long ago, 20 years ago, scientists had the same deficit and dispiriting conception of adolescence. We're here today because we as scholars and practitioners have a different vision of young people, and that is the frame that we'll be using for the next day and a half. So what is the positive youth development perspective? Where is it now, and where may it be going? And in the brief comments I have, I want to review this. I have slides which sort of summarize the dimensions of the field and its directions. And let me say right at the outset that because Patrick limited me to a 2.5-hour presentation this morning, I don't have enough time to go into every possible person, every possible study, every possible permutation of the field. So I'm just picking and choosing some, and so I apologize to those people who I'm not going to mention. And I also apologize to those people who I do mention, because I'm going to give you short shrift. 5 seconds of screen time. So, but we have a lot to cover in a few minutes. I think it was the White Rabbit who said it's best to start at the beginning. So let me start with a very brief history of the PYD perspective. And I'm going to start with the person who created the term as we now know it, Rick Little. Rick Little, in the late 1980s, very beginning 1990, got a huge grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to start the International Youth Foundation. And he started it with a frame that said young people have strengths, and there are 4 C's that we can talk about. Notice 4 right at the moment. Competence, confidence, character, and connection. Peter Bensen, in the middle of the 1990s, had a conference in Aspen. Karen Pittman was there as well. And at that meeting, 5th C was suggested, caring. There was debate back and forth, but we left that meeting saying, okay, now there are 5 C's. Now, all of this is before any data have been collected. We're just speculating about what the C's are. Then there was an SRA meeting, and Rick countered. He said, okay, if you guys want to up it to 5 C's, let me tell you what I think happens when you put 5 C's together. A 6th C emerges. When you have a young kid who is competent and confident, cares about other people, has good character, and is well connected, that young person will contribute. They'll become an active and engaged citizen and make a difference, not only in their family, but that as well, but their schools and their community. So contribution became the 6th C. By the end of the 1990s, Steve Hamilton looked out on this field, barely 10 years old, and said, really, there are 3 subcomponents here. First is PYD is spoken of as a developmental process. Then he said it's also a philosophy, or an approach to designing effective youth programs. And third, it reflects instances of programs that are not aimed at preventing per se, but at promoting. And I'll come back to that issue as we go along. So Steve presented a frame for thinking about the field that still is relevant and useful today. He also pointed out at that point that if we think of these 3 components as Venn diagrams, they're not perfectly overlapping. There are connections, but they're perhaps not as strong as they may be. And I think it's fair to say we're still there today. So let's use Steve Hamilton's frame and talk about these 3 components of the PYD perspective. So we'll start first with PYD as a developmental process. Now, the good news is that all the different, and there are a score of different PYD models out there, but all of them are linked by what is today the cutting edge of developmental theory, and this is developmental systems thinking, relational developmental systems. When we think of adolescence, in its historical context, we used to think that adolescents had a deficit because of the biological component to their being put there through evolutionary change. And whether we reject the recapitulationist notion of G. Stanley Hall or take Erickson's crisis model or Anna Freud's Adolescence and Developmental Disturbance, the field started out with thinking of youth as in deficit because of biological components. Today, we don't look at genes, physiological processes, as disembodied from the context within which they are functioning. We think of gene context regulation. We look at bidirectional relations, not only between genes and the supracellular, extracellular environment, but organisms and contexts. We look at the interrelation of all levels of organization within the developmental system. And that mutual influence between one level and another is what we call developmental regulation. And because this system includes temporality, includes history, time, marching through, there's always a potential for change, for systematic change, for plasticity. And this relational developmental systems view leads to the merger of not only multiple disciplines, because you can't do this just as a biologist or just as a psychologist or just as a sociologist or a historian. You have to bring all those disciplines together, but you also have to bring together research and application. Because to capitalize systematically on the plasticity of young people, we have to change those bidirectional relations in which they engage in the real world. Now, that's an arduous task. But because of plasticity, we can be optimistic that means can be found across the adolescent period to put every young person on a more positive path. And what that also means for those of us who are concerned with application, it is in our hands and the hands of kids, their families, and communities to make the world a more socially just place. Because of plasticity, we can level the playing field and find the means to put kids and context together to promote more positive development. So what are these processes, these models? Again, this is just a sample. We have Bill Damon, and I'm not going to, because of time constraints, read all of these things, and because 95% of you in the audience probably know more about this than I do. So Bill Damon looks at purpose. In fact, he looks at noble purpose. What are the things that make a young person matter, that give a young person meaning? And this, he believes, is a purpose, which allows that young person to reach out to the context, to try to matter in ways that are valued by not only him, but family, community, and people in beyond the community and the nation. And because you're doing things that matter to other people, if you're, to the extent you're efficacious, you're going to get positive feedback and be put on a positive path. Peter Bensen coined the word developmental assets and talked about the bidirectional link between the individual's strengths, the individual's developmental assets, and the assets that exist in schools, families, communities. And he labeled the 4 dimensions of this: support, empowerment, boundaries, constructive use of time. Jackie Eccles talked about stage environment fit and the role of motivation and how we interact with the world. We get expectancies of our abilities, we value certain activities, and we engage in these bidirectional relations based on the fit that we have with our developmental level and our context. Reed Larson, active engagement in real-life challenges. He looks particularly on community-based programs and looks at how young people can be active agents in their own development by affecting the world that is influencing them. So developmental regulation, intentional self-regulation in community-based programs. Margaret Beale Spencer looks at a variant of Yuri Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, where she puts the phenomenology of the young person front and center in trying to understand how the young person experiences the conflicts, the pressures, the prejudices that exist in their world, and how the young person, through their coping skills, can build more effective interactions in the face of what may be interpersonal and institutional racism. Stephen Mary Agnes Hamilton, looking at positive adolescent to adult transitions, in particular the school to work transition, both in this nation and around the world. And they have used, to elucidate these transitions, the ideas of transparency and permeability in young kids making these transitions. Ann Maston, who you might think, well, resilience is a characteristic of the person. No, Ann has focused on resilience as a dynamic process that is really relational in nature. Resilience doesn't exist in the person or in the context. It's in the dynamic relation between a developing person and a changing world. Richard Lerner and Jackie Lerner. Jackie was not able to be here today for family reasons. But here is the idea, which really comes throughout in all these other notions, that PYD is optimized when you align the strengths of young people with the developmental assets that exist in their families, communities, and schools. We use the 5 C's model to define the outcomes of these individual context relations, and also study how the 5 C's lead to contribution. So this is just a small sample of the different processes all linked within this relational developmental systems notion. PYD as a philosophy or approach to youth programming. Here too, there are literally scores of models, and I've just scratched the surface just to illustrate the richness of the diversity of ideas that exist in this area. I think the major statement that most of us know, and Reed's picture could be here as well, but I didn't want to ruin the pictures of Jackie and Jennifer by putting Reed up there. But Reed is as much a person who invented these pillars of positive youth development settings. In fact, I think he invented them, although it's in the Eccles and Gutman book. He can clarify that in the discussion. Catalano and Hawkins, who've done seminal work both in defining what a positive youth development approach is, and then actually doing it, as you'll see in a later overhead, some exemplary studies. Effective youth programs promote 5 of 15 outcomes. And here's a list of them. Jeannie Brooks Gunn and her colleagues Jody Roth. 3 characteristics of youth programs are activities providing opportunities for active involvement, an atmosphere of hope, caring, safety, support, and goals that go beyond prevention to include promotion. Bob Blum looks at 4 elements critical to successful interventions. People, so positive, sustained adult-youth relations, mentoring would be an example there. Opportunities for the youth to contribute in positive ways to their settings, activities that build skills, for example, in young people, and obviously, again, a safe, supportive, nurturing environment. Michelle Gambone, looking at the action framework for youth development, and she presents 5 hierarchically organized strategies that both practitioners can use and scientists can collaborate with them in studying. I couldn't go on without saying something about 4-H, so there's a 4-H idea, the heart, hands, head, and health model. There's always 2 components to each, so for example, hands is divided into both working skills and giving skills. The 4 essential elements, which also has been used with 4-H, belonging, mastery, generosity, and independence. And these present guidelines for the sorts of activities you want to build into programs or the skills you want to try to inculcate. Richard Lerner and the big, I'm sorry, I put up a picture of Patrick instead. I apologize. Talks about effective youth development programs, positive and sustained adult youth relations, life skill building activities, and opportunities for youth participation, and obviously for a little bad eyesight on my part, or fantasy level of aspiration. The Step It Up to Thrive program, the Thrive Foundation for Youth, is a California foundation. Building on Peter Bensen's work, identify the sparks that give a young person a passion, a purpose in life. Adopt a growth mindset following the work of Carol Dweck. Reflect on indicators of thriving, the 5 C's, and then build the skills for young people to go out and pursue their purposes effectively. And here, the Step It Up to Thrive program uses some of the work that Jackie Lerner and I have been doing, which builds off of Paul Baltus's work on intentional self-regulation, goal pursuit, goal selection, goal pursuit, and compensation in the face of blocked goals. PYD as instances of youth programs aimed at fostering the healthy or positive development of youth. And again, here, I'm going to take 3 minutes and just point out some really exemplary programs, but they may not be your favorites, so I apologize. I think the great work of the Social Development Research Group, Catalano and Hawkins, Community Youth Development Study, and the Raising Healthy Children Study. I'm sure we'll hear more about this work, but this is as good as it gets, this work. So in my view, this epitomizes what we should have in a youth development program. I don't know how many of you know Bill Kurtinus' work in Florida in the Changing Lives program, but this is a very complex, there was a special issue of Journal of Adolescent Research in 2008 devoted to this, but this is an incredibly effective program. I don't think it could ever be replicated because the hard work, the charismatic leadership of Bill Kurtinus was absolutely necessary for pulling the Miami community together around this work, and the outcomes of this are just incredibly impressive. Brian Flay and Carol Allred, the Positive Action Program, another just superb program that has developed an impressive curriculum and has been realizing tremendously positive and supportive results in the face of really good evaluation. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay. Prospects for the further development of the PYD perspective. We have these 3, if you will, the 3 Hamilton areas exist, but they're still not perfectly integrated. I think it's fair to say that the theories of Benson and Eccles and Spencer, et cetera, don't necessarily find their way into the design of the philosophies, and in turn, the fit between the philosophies and the programs is still not perfect. How can we become more integrated so that when Steve does his next statement of where the field sits, he'll say, yes, those 3 areas still exist, but they're coming closer together. I hope he'll be able to do that in his next review. One thing is, we need to build on what we've learned, and we've learned a great deal. And I picked just a few things to summarize, but again, this is bringing coals to Newcastle because we have the former editor of Journal of Research on Adolescence here, and people who were involved in the Eccles and Gupta book. We know a great deal about positive youth development. First, I think there is abundant support from multiple labs now that it's useful to define PYD by these 5 C's. They can be measured, they coalesce on a second-order latent variable, and just as you know, Jackie and I have been doing this work for 10 years through funds from both National 4-H Council and Altria, and we're just about to go public with a short form and a very short form of the PYD measure. So that has really good psychometric characteristics. There's a lot of strengths in young people. Intentional self-regulation skills, and we see this again in Reed's work, in other people's work, in a monograph in New Directions that Reed is an editor of. We just did a a special issue on the role of intentional self-regulation. And I think there's abundant data. This is a key skill set that provides strength for young people. Hope, not only in my own research, but for those of you who've been following the Gallup student poll, hope represents a key predictor of well-being, of engagement in young people. School engagement is become increasingly seen as an important special area of self-regulation. And there's going to be a special issue of developmental psychology. Pretty soon you may have seen the recent call for papers for that, just focusing on the role of engagement within the school context as an important predictor, not only of academic achievement, but of thriving more generally in school. Key ecological assets. Peter Bensen originally said there were 20. Well, it's very hard to find 20 things that are uncorrelated. So we've been able to reduce them in multiple labs to 4: individuals, institutions like out-of-school time programs, collective action like mentor-mentee partnerships, and then access, being able to get to these other resources. However, one of the things that we see across data sets, if you look at Gene Rhodes' work, for example, individuals are always the most important asset in a young person's life. And to me, that's a great leveler in American society, because you don't need to build fancy skateboard parks or have big computer labs. If you get adults who care, to use Yuri Bronfenbrenner's words, irrationally for a young person, will do anything to support the positive development of a young person, that ends up being the key asset promoting their positive development. Contribution is a key outcome. I don't see my colleague John Zaff here. His lab and his Office of America's Promise Alliance is in my lab, and he said he was purposely going to come late so he could avoid hearing me talk yet again, because he hears me too much down the hall. But the work of John Zaff and Peter Levine, and of course we have Connie Flanagan and Judith Purdah, who are the stars of this area. Contribution, civic engagement, active and engaged citizenship is the key outcome variable of positive youth development. And we also see that when you promote these life skills like intentional self-regulation and hope and positive development, you lower risk problem behaviors. However, one of the things that happens when you're around too long as an academic, you become sorry for some of the things you publish. And so before I started collecting data on positive youth development, I said, we don't have to worry about prevention any longer. All we need to do is promote positive development. And then I started collecting data. And it didn't work out exactly that way. We need both, because there are diverse pathways across adolescence, and there are diverse trajectories of positive and problematic development. So girls, in my data set with Jackie on the 4-H study of positive youth development, girls are at the highest levels of contribution. But if you look from grade 5 through grade 11, that's the last, we have data now through grade 12, but we've analyzed it through grade 11, what you see is depression continually increases in these girls who are becoming more and more active and productive, positive contributors. So you need both. And with that still in mind, that you need both prevention and promotion, it's still the case that the strengths of youth and their ecological assets do place kids on the most positive trajectories. So this is a summary, I think, that might be useful of the PYD model as it's come to be empirically verified in the past 10 years. We also need to work with key PYD promoting organizations. The last time someone counted that I know of, Jeannie Brooks Gunn counted in 1998 in a paper she actually published in Applied Developmental Science. There were 17,500 different youth-serving organizations in the United States. 4-H, which is in every county of every state, and there are over 3,900 counties, counts as one. Boy Scouts, how many Boy Scout troops, Cub Scout troops, counts as 2. Girl Scouts counts as 3. So when we say there's 17,500 different, we're talking of hundreds of thousands of different organizations. So obviously I don't have overheads for all of them. So I just want to hit on the key ideas here. We want to interact with the large national organizations. That's critical. That's one partner we must have. We also want to interact with the key intermediary or umbrella organizations. And I've mentioned in my view 3 exemplary ones. First, the Innovation Center for Wendy Wheeler. You probably know that. This one, I think, is no stranger to us because we have its co-founder and president and CEO, Karen Pittman. I know I'm not going to steal your thunder, Karen. I know you're going to talk more about this, but this has played a vital role in integrating the positive youth development perspective and bringing programs and scholars and resources together to really put kids on a positive path. And it's part of the next organization I want to mention. And again, I don't want to steal John Zaff's thunder, but America's Promise Alliance. Margarita Kondracki is president and CEO. John is the vice president for research. And what APA tries to do is to raise awareness, encourage action, and engage in advocacy to deliver these 5 promises to young people. And those 5 promises came out of an effort that, I don't know if you all know the story, but that Rick and Karen put together way back at that big presidential summit years ago. So they were foundational in shaping. And we also need, in addition to these large national youth-serving organizations and these intermediary organizations, we need to work with effective university-based centers that bring scholars together in a collaborative way with communities. And I know of one in particular that's really excellent. And so, oh, I got the right picture now, Patrick. Okay. So we need to work with these centers that provide the energy by training the next generation of PYD researchers and by modeling effective scholarly collaboration with communities. And so I'm very hopeful that with this new center being launched, we'll have a new vital tool in this collaboration to move forward. And so finally, if we put all this together, if we integrate the 3 Hamilton domains, and if we put together our collaborations across the large youth-serving organization, the intermediary organizations, the university-based centers, and build off of existing knowledge to provide evidence for next steps, we could really answer the big question that all of us ultimately want to answer. What actions, of what duration, with what youth, in what communities, at what points in adolescence can provoke what features of PYD and contributions? More simply, what our field is about, what we are about as scholars and as citizens of this nation, is we want to use theoretically predicated and evidence-based youth development program to foster the mutually beneficial links between an active, thriving young person and his community in a way that promotes social justice, democracy, and liberty. If we can answer that question in the next 10 years, it'll not only make Steve Hamilton happy when he does his next review, it'll be a legacy that we could all be proud of. Thank you very much.
The charge for you is to take seriously, which I know you already do, that last sort of statement of how do we think about, so that 10 years from now, what we know and what we can actually do to help promote effective citizenship, healthy youth, whatever term resonates for you most, and people who are fit, healthy, I've heard people talk about it that way. What can we do, and how can this conference be a place where you make some paradigm movement, I won't say shift, but that you expand your thinking and you help somebody else think theirs, or change theirs. So do some listening and do some talking. Tell people what you do, but listen carefully what other people do. But the idea we want to start to think about some concrete scientific and social activities that we can engage in to make that difference. So that's your charge to help us with the next few days. That's why we, as part of the main reason we invited you here as well, we wanted you to help us celebrate the Youth Center. So we have about 10, 15 minutes. We can get it started. If people have questions for Rich or comments that they'd like to bring in at this point to help us get started. There's 2 mics either side. If you want to step up to the mic, if somebody wants to get us started. I know you all have lots of opinions and lots to offer.
So the first one's always the hardest to get.
Yeah.
Not being able to stick around for the next I mentioned the charter school thing in my remarks, and last couple of years I was able to chair a panel around teacher preparation. And one of the things we find in that panel was it was a connection between developmental science and teacher preparation. The average teacher has 1 course in child development. All right, and I think I would ask you to react to the observation that there is an enormous disconnect between the field of developmental science, particularly around youth development, because almost all the organizations you put up there were community-based organizations, no schools. And so that seems to me a legitimate place that we should focus, and what your thoughts would be about that from a strategic standpoint of moving the field to at least embody and reflect that connection.
I think that's an excellent point. For numerous reasons, I'm sorry that John isn't here, but John Zaff just wrote a paper where he says we have to get beyond the concept of school reform and move to school transformation, to make schools as much a part of this nexus of collaborations as Boy Scouts and 4-H and Big Brothers, Big Sisters. How we do that is one of the reasons why we need this center embedded in a college of education. Because how you get schools to overcome all the challenges that they're facing just to survive and become an active part of a community that is focused on promoting positive development, not just educating, not just answering the parents who say, yeah, my kid is good because they're doing well in school, but by getting parents to use the vocabulary and have teachers understand that they can promote all these positive things through collaboration. I'm not wise enough to know the answer, but it's a vital next step, and why I think this center, located where it is in the Curry School, is going to play a major role in helping to figure out how we can create a model for doing that might be able then to go national. I would also ask that, even though you may not be here, ask that question again when John Zaff is in the room, because he has a much more detailed answer.
Well, we might these questions can then wrap into further comments. I just want, for help, since people come from very different backgrounds and very different kinds of work. Will you introduce yourself and the organization you're with when you first speak?
Great. I'm Rico Catalano from the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington. And you've seen my picture. Thank you very much for including me in your talk.
Twice. 2 pictures.
Twice. I did notice that, and I won't say anything bad about your talk as a result of seeing my picture.
Well, that's all it takes. That's great.
But I think Bob brings up really an important point. And if we're going to make this new transformation, I think the in-service education of our teachers, social workers, psychologists, the people that are really going to be out is really, really an important part of infusing that with, whether it's adolescent and child development, whether it's how to teach well in classrooms, whether for social workers it's how to promote positive community development to get the ecological systems in support of children, et cetera. I think that we really have to think through how are we translating this science that you've just summarized so well, Rich, to our classrooms, and I think that would go a long way.
I agree. We also need to get the money into our schools so that we can have teachers get that training. And in some states, they're taking away the money from these teachers because, you know, after all, they're... I'd love to know for those people who live in Wisconsin how they think that this could be done, given the political landscape in Wisconsin. But anyway.
Hi, Aletta Meyer. I'm at the Administration for Children and Families. And my sister graduated from VCU in education and got a fantastic education in all this stuff. 10 years ago, became a teacher, and the SOLs happened, Standards of Learning, and everything was forced out of her. So I would say, to add to Rico's comment, to have the people in power who employ those folks, because I think people actually, at least at VCU, were really well trained in this and very excited. And she was actually a master teacher, and she was one of the top 10. And most people who become one of the top 10 teachers in Richmond resign after 3 years. So there's a lot of people who are most inspired about this get really discouraged.
Huh.
So,
Aletta, do you know why? That's a remarkable statistic.
Well, she teaches kindergarten, first grade. She loops with the kids, and they probably have 10 or 12 hours of testing, sit-down tests for kindergartens and first graders on multiple choice tests. And just all kinds of things that she wants to do are hard, and she's kind of a pain in the neck for her principal. And she continues to do stuff, but other people who aren't as much of a pain in the neck as my sister resign.
Any questions, comments for this initial session? It seems to me that one of the things we're going to find is that we're starting to talk about promotion of healthy development, and this where I am right now, so maybe this is why it's so figural for me, but this boundary between promotion and prevention, and then even kind of just taking care of people and what that means. So, for example, I mean, in some ways, I spent time talking with a colleague about this a lot as we were trying to think of what are prevention systems that have made big societal impact. And we thought of two. One is the dental system. For some reason, in healthcare, we pay for prevention in dentistry. We don't pay for it in most of medicine, but we pay for it in dentistry. And we pay for it very regularly. Nobody seems to be terribly upset about it. And it's made a huge difference in the health of people in lots of ways that go well beyond the fact that you have all your teeth longer. And we have a universal prevention program, and this is now part of how we do it. If you think about it, another universal was, somebody said, probably it was Mr. Jefferson, that we need to educate everyone, and we need to find a way to do that. We didn't say, let's only educate the people who can't learn to read on their own, or let's only educate those who come from difficult backgrounds and need an extra boost. We said, this is something we need, and we somehow started to do that. And now we've sort of turned, and the idea that everybody should be educated, we're going to do that. And at some point, though, we kind of lost that, and it became this kind of technical thing we needed to get done in order for people to, for us to meet some standard of they can read at a certain level and so on. It stopped being this essential thing, which is that if people are educated, the society is going to run better, and whatever your criteria is for run better, whether it's economic or emotional or moral, whatever your thing that makes you think it's good, those things will occur, and we'll have more peace and more order, and those kinds of very grand kinds of goals. So I think somewhere in this conversation is for us to be thinking about the extent to which maybe our programs need to become kind of ways that institutions run, and to think about that, and I'm interested in how people might think about that. So, for example, how do we train teachers to operate in a system where there are SOLs, but where we know that if we don't have social emotional learning, we don't have classroom management, the SOLs aren't going to happen as well as won't matter. Oh.
I think
Okay.
Brad was up.
Go ahead. We'll get to that.
Since Rich challenged the people of Wisconsin, home of the Green Bay Packers, the only undefeated team in the NFL, to speak, I'm Brad Brown from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And just responding to some of the comments that we've heard so far, and actually being responsible for that one course that teachers get before we put them into a classroom, and recognizing that it's about to fall, we have to understand perhaps that schools may not be the best venue for this. Now, I agree with Rico that certainly pre-service and in-service training is important. But Rich, here's a question. Since we've seen, I think, most of the advances in positive youth development come from outside schools and organizations in which there is a heavy government influence, is it possible for us to move forward mostly through the sorts of organizations whose labels you put forward there, rather than to rely upon schools and the political football that they require? Can we make this happen in the absence of the efforts of schools, given that I see that as a pretty pessimistic venue in the near future?
I agree it's pessimistic, but it's a little bit like the statement that, made to Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do we need schools? Because that's where the kids are for 8 hours a day. So I'm completely pessimistic about the near term. But I just can't believe we live in a country where we're going to just totally decrease the power of schools to be places for the thriving of young people. I'm old enough to see these things come and go. And it may be very pessimistic in Wisconsin, and it's not much better in many other states. But we have to find the political will, and maybe Karen is online there to tell us how to do that, because she's a much more sage person in policy than I certainly am. But we can't abandon the idea of integrating schools into the community. If we do that, we're saying that basically we're abdicating 8 hours a day for 10 months a year of the 5 days a week that kids are in school. We can't do that. We have to find the political will. And this is where science stops, and we have to become advocates. We can't let that happen. I don't know how we do it in Wisconsin. I was only being facetious because of all the press that Wisconsin got. But right now we have a governor in Massachusetts that is pro schools, and he's supporting schools. But that could change also. We used to have Romney, and Romney was not a big fan of schools. He, for instance, he did away, to save money, to balance the budget, so to speak, he did away with what I think is called, for those of you in Massachusetts who know more about this, the rainy day fund, which was when there are challenges to the infrastructure of schools, when the plumbing breaks, when the plaster starts falling off. We go to this fund so that kids can go in a safe environment when they're in school. He did away with that fund. He zeroed it out. He also basically zeroed out the money for cooperative extension and 4-H. So and he would have been reelected had he run again. So it could happen even in the bluest of states, not just these purple states or the red state. We can't give up the fight. I don't know what we do. I mean, just as an aside, I said to my wife over the weekend, we make too much money. It's unconscionable. Let's give back some money. She goes, where are we going to give it? We're going to send in more money to the government so they can waste it on a war? What do we do? We need some political leadership. This is beyond my pay grade. I don't know the answer.
I'm Bart Hirsch, Northwestern University. And Rich, I'm very glad to see that a 6C was put up there, contribution. And what my colleagues and I have been doing, including Nancy Deutsch, who's part of this Youth-Nex here at UVA, is looking to see what happens when young people do contribute and what is the response of adults. And we've done this most recently in something that's just come out on Boys and Girls Club. And we noticed that catalyzes all kinds of positive adult reactions and systems of support that really were latent and helped to create new roles for young people. So I think the contribution is really important, because then it serves as a bridge or transition to think about how adults respond. And I think it's really interesting that, I think it's this afternoon or later, somewhere in the conference, we have a panel here, I'm reading Youth as Engaged Citizens, we have one in the media, and so on, because I think it's important to think, how can we get the rest of society to begin to think of young people in a different way? And I think that contribution element is a really important way to sort of generate that.
I share a student with John Zaff, Michelle Boyd, who came to the conference with me, whose work on just that problem and using media engagement and media knowledge, media competency to enhance youth's ability to both gain the knowledge they need to be active citizens and then to actually enact active, engaged citizenship. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Next. All right. Karen Pittman was up on the screen, the Foreign Youth Investment. I want to go back to this question about education, and I am not as pessimistic as some in the room, not only because I think we have to do something in that space for the reasons that you said, Rich, but because I think that there are movements happening that would actually allow us to broaden the definition of education in schools and out if we work quickly. So one of the questions I want to ask in the practical space, I can give examples, but I wonder if you can share examples, or Pat, of where you have seen schools actually begin to measure these C's in practical ways that then transform teaching and transform our expectations about what should happen in the classroom. Because obviously we know what measures matters. And so there clearly are ways to buck the trend of sitting kindergarten kids down to do multiple choice tests. New tech highs, for example, have very deliberately broadened the definition of readiness for young people coming out of high school, that half of it is about knowing academic content and half of it is about those C's. And that shows up in their report cards and it has to show up in teachers' lesson plans. So I think we have some practical ways to bring this research into classes and actually to use that as a platform for bridging the space between school and community organizations. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that.
I think I should defer to Bob and other people in this, but I do want to say that on December 20th, I have a meeting with Jim Clifton, who is the CEO of Gallup, as you know, to talk about his vision of developing a measure of PYD that he will get into his goal is, I guess Gallup can build this vision, to get this measure of PYD into every classroom in the United States. So,
and we can talk more about that during the day. We've been working with Gallup for a year and a half.
oh, I know.
And the only way that we're going to get this measure into schools is to get communities to own it first.
Yeah.
Because it's been offered to schools for 3 years and they're not picking it up.
Yeah, one of the things is the measure that we didn't have a good short form. So now Thrive Foundation has just supported us, and we're going to be able to get a measure of about 17 items. But Bob, yeah.
So one of the things to the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, however that will move out, the ways in which teachers' effectiveness and leadership effectiveness in a school are going to be assessed, we hope. But right now, even the fact that the administration is trying to advance those assessments, and those assessments are places in which PYD assessments could be built in, whether it's observations of teachers' behavior or whether it's kids reporting on their interactions with teachers, which are powerful levers for getting the system to attend to the very principles and processes that you put up there. But you have states pushing back on this right now, largely because of the threats, I think, largely to unions about these assessments. But that attending to those kind of dynamics as they move forward, those spaces in the education system are real leverage points for pushing the knowledge base of this field in there. And I think there's a couple of examples of this. Ron Ferguson does this work out of Cambridge, where kids are filling out his 7 C's. I don't know how many more you get at what the factor structure is there. But it's the same stuff. It's the same stuff.
I was just at a conference he had at Harvard a couple of months ago. Yeah. He's a colleague. So.
Hi. My name is Kathy Bellend, and I'm with School Connect, Optimizing the High School Experience, and I'm also the original author of Second Step, a Violence Prevention Curriculum which is now in 26 countries. And I only say that in that that gives me optimism. This is a program, Second Step has been around since the early 80s, and it does focus on creating caring school communities. And now my work, I've moved into high school, and there I see a challenge, and I try to stay hopeful. The thing that is optimistic about it is that schools are so interested in doing this kind of work. High schools don't know how to do it yet. They don't know how to fit it in. They don't know how to balance with all the testing, but there is a real desire out there. The other thing that gives me hope is in between my curriculum development, I spent 5 years at the Character Education Partnership in Washington, D.C., and helped develop something called the National Schools of Character. And I was really fortunate I got to go out and see these schools that had these incredible character education initiatives. An important part of the character education movement is connection with the community, community service. So I'm seeing that connection. We just need to, I think, get our movements together and talk about it. And so if anybody here is involved in schools, I'd love to talk to you over these 2 days. And I've always followed the positive youth development movement. And actually our co-author graduated from here. And we do have, so Karen Pittman, we're working on an instrument, and I know some instruments that you might be interested in.
Bonnie?
That's great. I would like to talk to you. I'm Bonnie Leadbeater from the University of Victoria in Canada. And in Canada, as I think in the States, the curriculum is written at the provincial level, and at least the guidelines, and then the resources are implemented locally. And in BC, we have a curriculum written on social responsibility that goes from kindergarten to grade 12. It's all online. You can look at it. And I think the challenge for us has been really around resources for implementing the curriculum. And we've worked very hard on a young children's program, which I'll talk a little bit about, the WITS program, which is designed around the social responsibility curriculum. But the motor came from the provincial writing of the curriculum. So there are people out there who can do this work and can make it happen. Maybe it will be our students, maybe it will be ourselves. Another sort of area of inspiration for me has really been the child health indicators literature, which is growing and growing. And I think one of the inspirations from that is that we really can think about children in terms of their well-becoming, or we can think about them in terms of their well-being. And we have to get a little careful about going too far ahead and thinking of them as assets without thinking about how are they doing today in their classrooms on a daily basis with their friends, who's recognizing their competence and their caring. So I think really, holding that model of well-being and well-becoming together is a healthy way to think about what we're trying to do. So,
we have time for really one more. I think then we want to not to stop the conversation, but just to take a break and move on to the next session.
Yes, I'm Judith Purdah from the University of Maryland, and thank you for the plug, Rich. First, a personal example. I was living in Chicago and a very good friend of Arnie Duncan's mother at the time she established her preschool on 47th Street. At that, I have been really quite surprised to see the extent to which this secretary has gone along the line of the testing movement, because he knows full well, having grown up and learned actually to play basketball with the kids on 47th Street, that the things which count in education are not measured by multiple choice tests, because actually on his mother's website, which someone keeps up for her, you hear all the stories of the students who have succeeded because of this preschool in which they had social emotional learning, or whatever you want to call it. And I want to suggest a group with which we may want to have some alliances, which hasn't yet been mentioned, and God forbid it's the economists. I was making a presentation at ETS this last spring on the subject of whether civic education and engagement, which is my field, should be included in the international large-scale assessments like TIMSS. And I think one of the most interesting things that happened is I was able to present some material suggesting that civics or social studies, or whatever you want to call it, along that line, which is not measured in these tests, actually contributes to what are being variously called non-cognitive objectives of education, which I think is a crazy thing to call something what it isn't. But social, emotional abilities, 21st century competencies, workplace competencies, these are better terms, but they all refer to something which is outside of math and reading. Right. And some of the economists, like Hank Levin and others, Hanchek's not got there yet, but got some interest, are beginning to say, you know, maybe part of economic competitiveness is the belief you ought to work hard, or your ability to work with other people. And many of those competencies can be folded in quite easily, I think, to the competencies, the C's, however many of them there are. And I think that's an alliance we should think of building. I think simply saying, unfortunately, we should have more teacher in-service training is a very good idea, but I don't think it's going to happen in the near term unless we're clearer about the contribution of what we want to do to the kinds of things which are of concern in the current economic and political situation.
I just want to add another name that is somewhat supportive of economists, Jim Heckman, who has now been focusing on, he calls it self-control. We got him off of it. He used to call it soft skills or non-cognitive skills, drove me crazy. I convinced him that executive functioning is not a non-cognitive skill and certainly not a soft skill. So he now calls it self-control. It's what many of us call intentional self-regulation. So I think he's very prone to be supportive. And he's worked with America's Promise Alliance. And so as a Nobel laureate, he carries a lot of cachet. So
let me move us on with recognizing there's a lot of character and a lot of commitment and a number of other assets that are critical in this room, and people who like challenges. And just to say, a transition from Jim Heckman, that in the last 9 months, we've been involved in 3 briefings for senior education and HS administration and staff around social-emotional learning as a critical part of development, in part because the World Bank is very interested in this as one of the most critical parts to development of developing countries and improvement of the world economy. We didn't go try to sell that picture. We were asked to speak about that picture because the economists and other people who are often sort of trying to direct these policies we're reacting to, they said we need to understand this because we think this is as critical as the science and math skills and so on. So I think there is reason, that's another point where I think there is some opportunity for optimism, but I think we also have some very, very challenging things ahead.